On this episode, we're talking about your work in the speculative, in the worlds of fantasy and horror. I'm curious about what connected you to this world of authoring and creating.
Well, it's kind of a funny story because it's like any real answer to this question, it's not any one thing. If I had to give myself sort of an origin point, though, the story I've always told is my sister used to actually be tremendously self-conscious, and she had gotten it into her head that she wanted to write stories. And at the same time, though, she was the kind of person at the time who was a little bit insecure with that kind of thing, and so she didn't want to do it alone. So
Mhm.
she needed somebody to be writing with her, and so she actually used to lock me in her room and force me to write stories alongside her. I was in third grade at the time, and I started actually. It's all gibberish. I have it in a notebook somewhere over here, but because my mom saved everything. But I just get used to filling notebooks with like my thoughts and like these ridiculously stupid narratives where I was just trying to be funny and silly. They often were like space stories and things like that, inspired by a lot of the films I grew up watching. And then as I got older, of course, that didn't last too long. We did that for like actually really a while for that age, like 3, 4 months. I filled like 5, 6 spiral notebooks. But eventually that kind of drifted away and, we went to doing other things. But I kept kind of coming back to writing short stories. Started reading more at that point as well, like getting into people like Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King's short fiction and stuff like that. And I was already reading a lot of fantasy by then too. And the more I worked on it, I started wondering if, anyone would ever want to read it. And so I just started handing stories over like my middle school and high school years to my teachers. And, some would just be like, oh, hey, that's really cool. And then others would actually, read through them, give me feedback, tell me what you thought. And I got a lot of really positive encouragement going through that. I had several teachers kind of pull me aside and tell me that they thought I was actually quite talented. And, things like that make a really big difference, that early encouragement from people you respect,
Mhm.
especially educators is, it's something that, can really make a long-term difference. And so, yeah, it was just something that I didn't always know I was going to be a writer, but I knew I was always going to write. So I kind of figured I'd do it alongside other things. But then just increasingly, I became more and more invested in it. And, it took me a while to get it to be a significant part of my career. I published poetry for about 15 years before I started getting any traction in anything. Of course, poetry is fantastic, but the only people who read it are the people subscribing to most of the literary journals, and the people submitting to them. And that's not the biggest market. There are people who make a fabulous living at it, but I wasn't. So yeah, I kind of ended up circling back to some of the stuff I really enjoyed writing as a kid. I still love writing poetry, just to be fair, but I loved writing space stories and monster stories and just spooky campfire stories and that kind of stuff. And I found that when I started working on that stuff, it was really easy to stay motivated. That I was able to really naturally just build page after page. And when Wicked House Publishing took my first novel, I was hugely thrilled by it. And I honestly, though, didn't really expect as many people to get their eyes on it as they did.
I get you. I get you. The world of authoring is an interesting and creative place, and I have also spent time as a poet, and yeah, it's an interesting world to try to market and try to share your ideas in. As you've gone through this world, how has your process changed or grown in any way?
That's an interesting one because there's some things that have stayed the same, and then there's some things that have changed really radically. The thing that stayed the same, and when I was an undergraduate at UTK, I was a computer science major coming in, and I was really unhappy with my program. They actually kind of lied to me to get me through the door, and I wasn't very happy about that. And at the same time, I was filling out my elective credits, and I ended up taking a poetry class with Dr. Arthur Smith, who Sadly, he passed around 2017, I think. Fabulous teacher, though. I had 6 classes with him across my undergraduate, my master's, and he was a brilliant poet and just a wonderful scholar. And one thing that he really taught me was to be very attentive to control of language, of control of movement through structure and through arrangement. And for poetry, of course, that's absolutely crucial. It's something that you can't live without. And I did pretty well in poetry. I have like 80 magazine publications out. I technically, you might say I did everything right. I just never seemed to build an audience in the process. But one thing I realized too, though, when I went to trying to pull together the novel that eventually became my first novel, I also realized that to me, there's a really intrinsic relationship with the way you control the experience of the reader in a poem and the way horror guides readers through the experience of the suspenseful scenes, the way it builds atmosphere, the way it builds tension, that level of language and structural manipulation has a lot of power in guiding how the reader moves through your sequences. And so that was something that I started really early on. I really worked to hone for a long time writing all those poems, but then when I moved into prose, in some ways, as part of I think what drew me into horror was that I really loved that moment to moment control that horror has to have. That I think is, I think it's a little unique compared to something like fantasy and science fiction. And don't get me wrong, I love those and I love working in them. But in science fiction. Now, of course, there is such thing as a bad info dump, 100%, no question. But you have some control over some, tightly prosed expositional segments. You can fall into discussion and description and explanation for a passage, and nobody's really going to question it. But when you're doing that, you're giving information, you're dealing with ideas, sometimes really big, fascinating ideas, but you've moved away from that experiential sensory level that you often do dwell in for the majority of a strong horror piece. Now, in terms of what's changed over the years, honestly, I do feel like I've gotten to be a lot better at both understanding and thinking about, and then also composing with structure. Writing my debut novel was an absolute mess. At one point I found myself 80% through my planned manuscript or planned draft, and then I realized that, and the book at this point was about 460 pages, and which seemed not that strange, coming out of science fiction and fantasy, and then reading a lot of doorstopper, horror like Stephen King. I was like, this seems pretty typical. But then I realized that none of my plot lines were converging in a way that I wanted, that everything I did just kept driving them further and further apart. And so, it really it was structurally failing. And I kept trying to rearrange and move things around until I ultimately realized I needed to cut out about 250 pages of material to make the book work. So I did that, and I wrote in another 125, some subplots, but really keeping it anchored to one central family that felt much more unified. And then after that, I learned a lot about the way not just like scenes progress and the way scenes can flow from one into another, even if you're shifting points of view. I really also started thinking about, what is the macro picture of a novel? If you step back, how is the novel itself divided up? When you weigh in all of the points of views or all of the themes, and then also when you focus in on individual characters, how are they laid out and how are they paced within that larger set of arcs? And it really, I do feel like I learned a lot from absolutely flailing around like a fool during that first drafting.
I was going to ask about that movement between genres because it looks like you have science fiction influences, fantasy influences, horror. So it sounds like each one of those allows you to do a particular kind of avenue of expression in your work.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Like for example, I have a young adult fantasy novel called The Neverborn Thief, and I'm tremendously fond of that book. It's been the one I've had the hardest time finding a market for, but that's partially because I think I released it after I'd really learned the horror market well. And I'd moved away from the fantasy market for a long time. I read it all the way up probably into the late aughts. And then just for one reason or another. Actually, no, I mean, I can tell you the big reasons are A, Robert Jordan dying, B,
Mm-hmm.
G.R.R. Martin ceasing any meaningful progress on Game of Thrones, and then Patrick Rothfuss crashing out in the Name of the Wind series. And I
Yeah.
started getting really frustrated with the idea of epic series and that longer form fantasy storytelling. And unfortunately, at the time, I also was not very good at finding smaller, more discrete works in fantasy. And so I did kind of put that reading on hiatus for a long time. And so when it turned out to be time to try to get back into marketing fantasy, honestly, I didn't even know where to go. When I dove into horror, it was really easy for me to talk about some of the movies that I'd been enjoying, talk about some of the writers I'd read over the last 4 or 5 years, to start asking meaningful questions, to start conversations. And fantasy, I just found myself realizing, I don't even know what tropes people are writing right now. And but at the same time, when I worked on Neverborn Thief, one thing I really wanted to do was I really wanted to work with stories that have a lot of sub stories within it, almost an anthology style narrative. Now, Neverborn Thief isn't quite anthology style, but it does have a lot of segments where the characters tell each other myths of the world in which they inhabit. And that was really the key to sort of thinking about how that world existed and what it felt like to be part of that world, was to try to think in myths and think about how myths reflect themselves and echo into the way people interact and what motivates them. And so I found that book really allowed me to think about characters and people through a very particular lens, which I was really wanting to explore at the time. Now, for science fiction, I'm not going to lie, I'm an absolute science geek. I actually read academic journals in astronomy and in
Nice.
physics.
Nice.
And I'll say, just for 100% transparency, some of the math absolutely goes over my head. But I've been at it for a long time. Conceptually, I keep up, I think, pretty decently. And so, I've always wanted to write, not just like science fiction, but like, science fiction that deals with meaningful science, that actually is trying to have not, I'm not trying to write a scientific paper. I would have gone into physics or something if that was my desire. But I do want to write something that somebody who's interested in science is going to sit down and be like, huh, that's a neat aspect of the universe that I want to explore more about, or that's a neat aspect of the universe that has really cool implications. And so yeah, there's like an intellectual discovery for me in getting into science fiction. That's one of my absolute favorite things in the world. It's actually why, even though most of my novels fall under horror, um, they all do have they all do have scientific elements to them. So Mobius Story, I've been told, is a horror novel with a science fiction premise hidden underneath it. Deals with like multiverse questions, certain elements of like cosmology and existential questioning about like the nature of the mind. Gets into psychological science a decent bit. Galatalk is a post-nuclear narrative set 40 years after a nuclear exchange where society's recovered, but at its core, its central premise is driven by research into non-carbon-based life forms, and the way in which they'd function, what they'd eat, and things like that. And those things have some pretty significant underlying elements throughout the narrative. And then, of course, Extinction Dream is, straight on science fiction. It's I call it like 70-30, 70% science fiction, 30% horror. That one was a lot of fun though, because one thing I really wanted to do with that one, which was inspired by Danny Boyle and Alex Garland's Sunshine. I really loved the movie. I do think it fell apart a
Mm.
little bit at the end, but one thing I loved is that the scientific plausibility of the ship itself. You can forget the whole sun is dying premise, which I know stretches science really, really roughly. But the spaceship itself was fascinating, and I loved the way they portrayed it. And so when I sat down to write Extinction Dream, a significant portion of which takes place in orbit, one of my biggest goals was to try to create a relatively engineeringly credible space station. So,
Mhm.
gravity works depending on the momentum of the particular arm of the station they're in, because, of course, it is using that sort of rotating model. I had to research the dimensions that would be required to create specific levels of G-force, which would allow for various different, scientific operations for things like medical things to take place. And it was really fascinating to really get into these like speculative, and a lot of it was done through engineering forums and stuff like that. There's some pretty deep dive conversations going on out there where this really smart people are having really fun imaginative conversations about what would this actually look like. And I was just, it was an absolute gold mine and a total blast to run through.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask about that research process that comes into your work. So it sounds like that is alive and well and vibrant, and your curiosity also feeds your creativity.
Yeah, I talk with people about research quite a bit because yeah, I just did a podcast with Joe Meinhardt from Crystal Lake. It's called their like master's class, and there are folk who are wanting to ask me about writing science fiction in particular, especially science fiction horror. And one of the big topics we ended up covering was research. And one thing I will say that I think does give me some advantage over folk who are sort of like, I want to write a space novel. How do I get started? Is um, I already read a lot of this stuff. I've always tried to read broadly. Like when I actually, one of the best ways I like to explain it is when I was an undergraduate. I think I needed to have something like, I don't know, 130 credit hours or something like that, and I graduated with somewhere like 195 because I actually took an extra year to take 2 semesters of nothing but electives. I just wanted to take classes in a bunch of different fields. And so, like, I took a couple of biology classes, a couple of ecology classes. I took some religious studies classes, a couple of philosophy classes, a critical theory class. And then, out of those classes, I just continued reading in those fields. So, like, I'll order the latest critical theory book by Homi K. Bhabha, or something like that. Just whatever people seem to be talking about. I'll be like, oh, I'll check this one out too. And then, if I get interested in it, I'll start looking up its ideas and its sources. And then, that just kind of keeps going on. I've always been, I come from a medical family. My sister ended up becoming an emergency room physician. And so we talk about medicine all the time. My mom was a nurse for her career too. And so I read a lot of medical papers too. And I definitely keep up with like the popular level of, what you see about medicine and like popular science or something like that. But the biggest trick, though, is that research really should just be. I think people who want to research or want research to be a part of their writing will do best if they just engage in inquiry and then they think about
Mm.
how those ideas could intersect with the projects they're writing. And yeah, sometimes you do specific research around a topic focused for a book. So, with Extinction Dream, for example, once I decided I wanted to write a book set in orbit, then I was like, okay. So I need to start figuring out, what are the actual mechanics of this station. There's a couple other things I had to research for it, but one thing that made a huge difference in that process that kept it from being laborious or overly difficult was that I already knew what questions I was going to need to ask.
Mm.
I had that working level of knowledge about the subject, and I think when people say write what you know, I really think that's the core of the idea. It's not like, you can't write something that you're not an expert in. You can't pretend that you're a type of person or profession you've never done before. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, we write fiction for a reason. We want to explore these different things. But I think if you want to write credibly about something, it's going to be easiest if you start from a place that has enough working knowledge that, yeah, you know where the inquiry is.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I really try to kind of keep myself in that place where, some subjects I'll read kind of shallowly on. So, like, I'll read about, I don't know, political tensions that exist between, say, like, Australia and New Zealand, because there is actually a little bit of tension there. They have some longstanding frustrations. I'll just read a couple of things about that, and then I may never go anywhere with that, but maybe a couple of years from now, I want to have a character who's from New Zealand, and maybe that's going to be. Then I'll be like, oh wait, he's from New Zealand. I wonder what he thinks about, those tensions that were happening. Maybe I want to look up where that's at now. And, then now I can think about how his character's changed over a couple of years. And suddenly I have, a kind of a little cross section of this character. And it's only because I just happened to read a handful of, random facts earlier. And then it was like, oh, wait, maybe that's useful here.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, anything that you'd like to say about the current project that you're working on, what's next for you, and where people can find out more?
So I've got a couple of things coming. One, I have to admit, I have an enormous piece of news that I can't share. I'm actually not allowed to right now. And it's both tremendously frustrating but hugely exciting. Yeah, I will say keep an eye out in Publishers Weekly on Halloween. So there's going to be there should be a really big announcement then. Beyond that, though. I have one novel coming out. It's called Dead Hearts Eat the Light. It's scheduled for a second quarter 2026 release through Wicked House Publishing. And premise is it's about a 12 and a 9-year-old girl. And one day they're at home after school, and suddenly their father comes home early with a shotgun. And he shepherds them down very quickly into the basement where he reveals an underground shelter beneath it. He gets the kids to go down into it, and then he seals them in. And the rest of the story is told, or the story is told entirely through the girl's point of view, as what may or may not be an apocalypse is occurring around them, and they have to try to figure out how to a keep themselves alive in the shelter, and then B, if there is a way to leave and if they should leave. And it's about to go into editing. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. This one does pull some of my favorite elements of horror, and it actually brings in a little bit of what I like about fantasy. There's a little bit of myth making in this one, which I'm excited to see how people feel about how that shows up in horror. And then other than that, I'm currently working on what's called a lit RPG. I discovered the genre through Dungeon Crawler Carl and Matt Dinneman, and
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
absolutely devoured 6 books of that series before I had to go back to work. But fabulous stuff, and started reading more about the this larger genre, and it's really fun. And I'll say. I do think, in a lot of different ways, we're living in really stressful times. I think there's a lot of people in every direction who are very alarmed. People are just really anxious and frightened for various different reasons. And I think that's true no matter what sort of political side you're on or whatever. I think everyone right now is kind of driven by a lot of fear and a lot of concern about what's going on. And, as a result of that, though, I've been writing some pretty heavy science fiction, some pretty heavy horror. I did want to sort of move in a lighter direction for a bit. So the lit RPG I'm writing is it's called Quiet Veil, and it's actually a horror comedy. And not going to get into the plot details of it yet, but I'm about I don't know, maybe 15% into the main draft, and it's just been an absolute blast to write. It's exactly what I needed to dive into, sort of mentally and psychologically, because if I want to make myself laugh first and foremost, and then hopefully other people think it's funny too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, have we missed anything in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
Um, Well, one thing I always like to plug that often gets left out of a lot of things is that I do love to point folk who want a little bit of a lighter, more sort of sillier horror read. I've got a book called Try Not to Die in the Shadowlands. It's a choose your own adventure horror fantasy novel, part
Love
of the
it,
Try Not to
love it.
Die series. And if you're looking for something that has some serious elements, because it is, it's both horror and it's fantasy, so there's some thoughtful stuff. But also, every few pages, you got to make a choice that determines whether you live or die. You know, uh, the deaths are pretty inventive, but the fantasy image is pretty vivid, I think. And so I think it's a fun reading experience if somebody wants to sort of just chill out and see something different. And if you like it, while that's my only Try Not to Die to date, there are about 30 or something more books in that series, and they're absolutely fabulous.
Cool, cool. Well, Andrew, many thanks for the time. Many thanks for the conversation. It is an open channel anytime you want to talk about creativity and genre and all sorts of things. And great to meet you and have the chance to feature you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.